Hey guys, it's Generalkidd here. How's everyone doing today? So, as you all might know by now, recently a lot of early in development builds of Halo CEA Anniversary for the Xbox 360 just dropped. While these builds were pretty incomplete and unfinished, they were fully playable from start to finish, and it didn't take long to notice quite a few interesting things about these builds. Now, it is in my opinion that a lot of aspects of the game do appear to have gotten downgraded in the final release, and in this video, I'll be showing you several of those aspects. But of course, that goes without saying, sometimes there are very good reasons for certain things to get downgraded, such as for performance reasons or even artistic choices. So, the purpose of this video isn't to criticize the fact that things might have been downgraded, but rather as a technical overview of what changed for the final release, how it differs, and what might have been. Alright, so let's get right into it. We'll start with one of the most glaring differences, which is Master Chief himself. This version of Chief was first seen in the original announcement trailer for the game, and has definitely changed in the final version. However, this is where the first downgrade can be noticed. Here's Master Chief in this beta build, and here's Master Chief in the final version of the game. Compared to the final version of Halo Anniversary, Chief in earlier builds seems to have higher quality textures of his armor. Everything just seems sharper, the details and everything like that. I'd say the visors are about the same, but the rest of the armor in the final version just appears to be a bit blurrier and more dull. This may be due to the textures being more compressed in order to meet the performance limits of the Xbox 360, because this build ran pretty poorly on the Xbox 360. Some of the cutscenes would run at like 20 FPS or lower, and even in gameplay, some parts of missions will drop to as low as 10 FPS, even lower sometimes. So, Saber would have definitely needed to do more optimizations at this point in order to get the game to a more acceptable performance level. But that's just for the level of detail for the textures. There is another change that's particularly interesting, which is the overall color of the armor. Now, this one is most definitely an art decision, and it's really more of my personal opinion that it was downgraded. I do personally prefer the darker shade of green for the older version of Master Chief and Anniversary graphics. However, I assume the lighter shade was to match the original classic CE graphics version of Chief, which was also lighter green than in later Halo games. But I'm somewhat skeptical about it being done to match the original more closely, because there were other changes in this game that we'll get to later that actually matches the original game even less after the change. But I guess for Master Chief, I'll give Saber the benefit of the doubt for now. Anyways, I just personally prefer the more detailed and darker green Master Chief from the older builds of CEA. It just looks cleaner, sharper, and a little, grittier to me, for a lack of a better way to describe it. But again, a lot of this does kind of boil down to my personal preference. But I think we can all agree that the texture quality does seem to be reduced a bit in the final version, which may very well have been to help with performance. Okay, next up is a small but impactful change. One of the coolest features of Halo CE Anniversary is that you could switch graphics modes between Classic and Anniversary graphics with just a single press of a button. This feature even continued on into Halo 2 Anniversary and MCC, not to mention some other games like the unreleased GoldenEye 007 remaster that also had this feature. However, in Halo CEA, there was a major restriction, which was you couldn't use this feature to switch graphics modes mid-cutscene. If you wanted to watch a cutscene in one graphics mode or another, you'd have to set that setting before the game starts, or once you're in gameplay after the cutscene, switch graphics and then restart the mission. Only then can you watch that cutscene in whatever graphics mode you wanted. Even on MCC, this restriction still existed. Halo 2 Anniversary actually removes this restriction and allows you to instantly switch graphics modes even mid-cutscene. At the time, I thought maybe it was some kind of engine limitation that was improved upon in Halo 2 Anniversary, but once I tried it out in this beta build, it turns out you were able to switch graphics modes mid-cutscene just fine. Being able to switch back and forth in cutscenes in Halo 2 Anniversary was really cool and let you compare the differences easily and quickly, but in CE Anniversary, that just wasn't possible. So, for whatever reason, this feature worked fine in beta builds, but was disabled in the final build, only to be enabled in Halo 2 Anniversary. Why was it disabled in the first place? I'm not sure really, but I suspect it might partially have something to do with the next thing we're going to talk about. That next thing is how long it takes to switch between graphics modes. In the final release, Halo CE Anniversary will fade to black briefly when you switch graphics modes. It will do this regardless of which way you switch it. It wasn't instant switching between modes like it was in MCC or H2A. However, in this older build, switching modes was somewhat faster, especially when it comes to switching back from Classic to Anniversary. So, in this build, there was no black screen when switching graphics modes. What actually happens if you try to switch modes is the game will freeze for a second and then switch. But after this initial freeze, you can switch back instantly. You can continue switching back and forth relatively quickly from this point on, although as you move through the mission or you just play a little bit longer, the game will have to load new things and you'll start to get freezes again when switching. So that's probably why the Fade to Black exists on the release version. It was literally just to cover up the freeze. The freezing happens simply because the Xbox 360 isn't powerful enough to handle regular instant switching of graphics modes, even if the beta build technically could do it a few times. The Xbox One could handle it just fine though on MCC, which is why the black screen no longer exists, and on PC as well. So unfortunately, this is another downgrade because of the limitations of the Xbox 360's aging hardware, forcing such a trade-off. This is probably also why mid-cutscene switching was disabled in the final release. Freezing the game mid-cutscene or fading to black might have just disrupted the cutscene way too much, and it just wasn't worth the trade-off. But unfortunately, it was just never re-enabled in the MCC version of CE Anniversary either. So that downgrade unfortunately still exists to this day. I was really hoping on MCC at some point they would have, removed that limitation, let you switch graphics modes between cutscenes, but it just never happened. So let's move on to some other characters in Anniversary graphics, mainly Captain Keyes. The changes and arguably downgrades for Keyes are quite puzzling, since this time it can't be for performance reasons. Let's start with Captain Keyes in the Jenkins helmet cam cutscene. In the original Halo CE cutscene, Captain Keyes had a variant where he wore some combat gear into a potential combat zone. That makes sense. However, in Anniversary graphics in the final version, he ended up wearing the same dress uniform he wore on the Pillar of Autumn into a combat zone. Some people pointed out that, bizarre flaw since the very beginning, that it didn't make much sense for Keyes to wear that outfit into battle. And as it turns out, Saber did think of that at some point, and in the beta build, the cutscene actually uses a different version of Keyes that's in combat armor. While he's more heavily armored than in the original Halo CE cutscene, this version makes more sense and actually matches more closely with the original CE cutscene. Like really, Keyes was fine in this beta cutscene. There were no issues with him. I can't think of any reason to cut this model and reuse the same dress uniform version from previous missions. For whatever reason, Saber went with the wrong model instead and cut the correct version that the beta build already had. I'd really consider that a visual downgrade, and maybe even like an oversight of Keyes for simply using the wrong version of him when they already had the correct version at one point. And I don't know why that change happened. I don't think it was for artistic reasons. I don't think it was performance reasons either, so I'm not sure. And speaking of downgrades for Keyes, the other downgrade for him is his flood form when he became part of the Proto-Gravemind. This one is quite a night and day difference as well. The beta version of the Proto-Gravemind was highly detailed and even matches the color scheme of the original version in CE. This version, you can actually see clearly the faces of other humans that were combined together into the Proto-Gravemind. And upon closer inspection, you can even see other body parts and skeleton remains in this version. It's honestly a much more terrifying version of the Proto-Gravemind. The final version, upon release, however, tones this down a lot, and reduces the details too. The final version basically tones things down by blurring it out and covering up some of the faces on the sides, and then it basically covers up the rest of the Proto-Gravemind in green goo, which makes it look more like later versions of the Flood a little bit. But, however, the original Proto-Gravemind in classic graphics was not green, nor was it gooey. Therefore, the beta version more closely matches the OG version in that regard. I can understand the texture detail being reduced for performance reasons again, but I have to wonder why other details, why other things like the faces and human skeletal remains were effectively toned down or covered up by these changes, like the goo. I mean, CE Anniversary, it was still rated M, so they probably weren't trying to tone things down in order to get a T rating, like, like they did with Halo 5 and Infinite. So I'm not sure why. I'm guessing that probably was another artistic choice to make the Proto-Gravemind look more zombie-like, with all the green gooey colors and certain details just, had to get sacrificed and covered up as a result. At least it's not as bad as what 343 had to do with the China version of CEA on MCC, because that one, they had to completely remove all the textures and details from the Keys Proto-Gravemind. It's just like a giant gray blob as a result, and they did it in order to censor it for the Chinese government's approval. But yeah, I mean, aside from that, I guess the differences here between the pre-release and the final version of the Proto-Gravemind, I guess these are subjective for which one is better, because I mean, aside from the lower texture quality, it just comes down to personal preferences as well as your opinion. But it is what it is. All right, moving on to the next aspect. This one is a bit more subtle, but actually makes a lot of difference too, and is also a lot of content that was cut out in the final version of CEA. This one has to do with cutscene animations. Halo CE Anniversary was more than just a reskin for CE. It actually added new and improved cutscene animations and camera angles. Most of these new improvements to the cutscenes are a little subtle, especially if you don't have the original CE cutscenes memorized perfectly. But when we look at the beta version of the cutscenes, it looks like Saber was going for a much more significant rework of the cutscenes, which included completely new and overhauled individual character animations, as well as entirely new things added to the cutscenes, plus drastically different camera animations and angles too. Take the Pillar of Autumn intro cutscene, for example. Ignoring the fact that these cutscenes are still incomplete and missing some stuff, right off the bat, you can see there's a lot more going on in the beta version of the cutscene, such as multiple squadrons of longswords flying in formation around the Pillar of Autumn. It's actually pretty cool seeing all these squadrons flying around and circling it. Plus, the camera angles are completely different too from the final version. Like, drastically different. In fact, the camera movements, like, they're so much more dramatic in this version. And they're probably not even finalized either, but like the way they move is just way more dramatic. And as for individual characters, you can see in this next cutscene that the characters are more alive, so to speak. These animations in a beta build, they give characters a lot more body and hand movements compared to the original cutscenes, and and even the final release. It's the same case with a lot of other cutscenes too. Some are close to the final version, but a lot of others have both the different camera angles and animations, as well as the different and more animated character animations. Really, the final release of CEA mostly just uses the same character animations as the original CE does, maybe with some small differences here and there. But this earlier beta build, which is, less than a year till release, had these completely revamped cutscenes with new animations that unfortunately were cut and unused, and instead, more basic character and camera animations were used. I feel this is another downgrade, because while the final version of the cutscene does match the original more, which is fine, that is kind of the intent, it was a missed opportunity to upgrade the cutscenes, like what they did with Halo 2 Anniversary, except without the blur cutscenes. But honestly, this is more or less a personal preference on which you prefer as well. There's definitely pros and cons to both versions of these cutscenes. So the next downgrade we'll be looking at is also quite subtle. In fact, I didn't even notice this one until my friend pointed it out to me. This one pertains to the shield, floor, and wall effects. This is what it looks like in the final version of the game, and this is what it looks like in the beta version. See the difference? Once again, the beta version is more detailed with the effects. The beta version of the shield floor has these hexagon energy patterns going on for the shield effect. It looks a lot cooler and is subtle enough that it doesn't completely change the aesthetic either. You could argue the final version is meant to be closer to the OG version in CE classic graphics, but this isn't something that would have been a controversial change to the art style, especially with how subtle it is. So this is another puzzling downgrade to me. It's possible that the effect might have been a bit more resource intensive than the final version, so the downgrade was needed to once again hit a level of performance that was acceptable on the Xbox 360, but I don't know for sure why this was downgraded. These deployable covers also look a bit different between the two versions in the beta and final release as well. And again, I'm not sure why these changes happened, but like a lot of these other things, it might have been for artistic choices, for whatever reason. And speaking of shields, this one I've actually seen some people debate about on Twitter. The elite shields in the beta version are actually much more noticeable too, and have a much cooler effect to them. However, in the final release, these effects also seem to have been toned down a bit and are less noticeable compared to the beta version. The beta version just looks a lot better, in my opinion, and the final version is basically a downgrade from that. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at the overall aesthetics of the game's visuals and art direction. The art really changed a lot between this build and the final release 5 months later. What I'm particularly referring to is things like the skybox of maps, as well as the overall environments. Take the mall, for example. Aside from the lack of water, the intro cutscene is largely the same, except it's set during an afternoon sunset. I think the skybox is a lot more beautiful than the final version we got. It doesn't really change much overall, but something about that sunset just hits harder in my personal opinion. And then there's the mission Halo. I'm assuming the appearance of this level is due to it being unfinished, but honestly, I feel like this version has almost a grittier and somewhat more realistic look to it. The final version isn't bad either, but I kind of like this beta version more. The same goes for the main menu background. This has also gone through a lot of changes and looks quite different. I just like how there's a bit more going on in the beta background. While it doesn't match the original as closely, I do appreciate the more details that were added. The location looks pretty cool and somewhat more realistic to me too. There's just more going on in general. However, that is also where I believe the flaws are in the final version of CEA. I know Halo CEA Anniversary generally gets a bad rep as far as Halo remasters go, but I always felt it was fine for the most part. I mean, I never quite liked how they largely just reused Halo Reach assets for pretty much everything, but that wasn't what I felt was ultimately the main weakness of this remaster. What I think is the main flaw of the final release is that Saber kind of overdid it, if you know what I mean. Like, things look nice, but I feel like what ironically makes it kind of a downgrade from the beta release is that they just tried adding way too much to it. In this case, I feel like sometimes less is more. At least that's just how I personally feel about the CE remaster. Like, it's still great, but I just feel like that's, it could have been a little bit, things could be a little bit different. Okay, so the next thing, actually the last thing we'll be taking a look at that was kind of a downgrade, is actually one feature that was available in the beta build, but not in the final release. The main one I'm talking about is the Bang Bang Skull. This was a cut skull for Halo CEA that was officially available on the main menu of the beta release, but was removed in the final release. It can technically be re-enabled again with modding on the Xbox 360 version, but it wasn't meant to be accessed anymore. What this skull does is replace weapon sounds in-game with human imitations of the sounds. Here's an example with the assault rifle. Sounds like a really fun skull, doesn't it? Unfortunately, it seems only the assault rifle had its sounds replaced by the skull, and ultimately the skull was cut in the final release. So I'm guessing the skull was unfinished, and there just wasn't enough time to actually finish it and add all the sounds. So they cut it. We did get all the other skulls, but we lost one skull, and thus I consider that, a more literal downgrade nonetheless. It would have been nice to get that skull in the final game, or even on MCC, but it just seems like it would have been such a fun skull to have. Alright, well, that's about all the aspects of the game that I feel were downgraded between the beta build and the final release. At least like the main, the more noticeable ones. And like I said, it's perfectly normal for things to change between beta builds and final releases. Oftentimes, things get added or things get cut. In the case of CEA though, the changes were substantial, for better or for worse. A lot of things did improve, such as the performance, but I think some of the performance improvements were also due to trade-offs made with downgrading certain aspects of the game. Also, I'm guessing the game didn't have as long of a development cycle, and to meet the release date, they had to cut some features. That's just how it works. Overall though, it's very interesting to see the development process behind this game. at different points in the development process. The before and after are night and day in some cases. Some changes might have been for the better, and others are a glimpse at what could have been. The CEA remake, it's still a nice game, and I'm glad we got it at all. But it is interesting to learn some history about the remaster. Anyways, that wraps it up for this video. Hopefully you all found it to be interesting, and as always, if you did, make sure to leave a like, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious what you all think about these downgrades, if you even agree that they were downgrades. But yeah, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, guys.